This is a talk I gave at the symposium in Belmont in February, so it's a reissue, second time around. I'm not sure it's getting better with age, but we'll see. Some background. There's some people involved here, I think. Probably out. Oh, were you at the curry lunch today? And you're back now? Okay. Some background, and most of us here are involved with testing in some way or other. It's sometimes useful to remember why we do it. It might be a detailed chemical analysis, it might be something that we're trying to mimic end-use conditions and predict what's going to happen in real life. And we do this routinely, a whole bunch of routine reasons for testing, and then there's the non-routine reasons. You know, our competitors are doing something, we want to figure out what they're doing, or something went wrong, or someone complained, we're trying to develop new products, and so on. And one of the things that's going to become clear is that when we're dealing with polyester and spandex blends, we might be dealing with both routine and non-routine reasons for testing. Most of us know about color fastness testing. And we've been using these tests for many years, and we typically know what the test reflects. And we usually expect that once the fabric's been dyed and finished, won't change much in terms of fastness as it moves down the rest of the supply chain and ends up on a store shelf somewhere. Start thinking about some of the subtleties that are involved. There are some subtly different aims for the test people. So the people who sit in these rooms year after year and develop new test methods typically are trying to predict what's going to happen in real life to something. We'll use a lab test as a proxy for real life. Over time, the people using the tests day in and day out often sort of gloss over that and maybe just throw it into a spec and trust that the end use is going to correspond to what the test does. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. And then we get further down away from reality and or towards reality and away from theory. And people start to use the test for the reasons it was never intended for or doesn't claim to do. And most of us do the test method 61 at some point or other. I'm not sure how many people do remember this. The staining part of that test is not designed to reflect what's going to happen in 5 home laundries. We kind of do the test and we look at the stain, but no one claims that it corresponds very, very closely to real life. But we still do it, because oftentimes it tells us that there's some loose dye there somewhere that may cause a problem sometime. And, okay, we get bad stains there, maybe we should reject this. The alternative is to do a whole bunch of other tests to try and say, well, there's loose dye there, where's it going to give you the problem? Is it a water test, a perspiration test, dye transfer and storage, and so on? So again, the reasons for testing slip away from the intent of the original developers. So that's some testing background. Now, the problem we're faced with on polyester spandex, well, let's look at the polyester part of this first. We've been dyeing polyester for more than half a century. We know the dyeing methods and the problems pretty well. We know it's a fiber with a high glass transition temperature. We dye it with low solubility dispersed dyes. That once the dye is in there, the fiber cools down, it re-solidifies, the dye is essentially locked in place. We know that for dark shades we're going to reduction clear it, or maybe oxidize clear it, or somehow we're going to get rid of that surface dye. And if we don't do that, that dye might rub off or wash off in a laundry test somewhere. So we're pretty happy with this. We also know that sometimes dye solubilizers might be around somewhere. And if they are sitting on the surface of polyester, they may gradually dissolve dye out of the fiber. So things like softeners, oils, non-ionic detergents, and again, over time, dye might come to the surface, but we'll see that usually in a crop test. And we also have this unique feature of dispersed dyes that they will sublime. So sometimes low energy dyes, if they go through a heat treatment, may mark off the result of that heat. Love that guy. So there's the spandex part of things. So we mostly originally used in nylon blends, and we had very satisfactory results with that. And nylon's expensive. So let's see if we can do this with polyester. So we can lower the cost to where merchandisers want to be, and then we hit the buts. If we dye the polyester really well at high temperature, we start to risk the spandex quality. So getting the good results on polyester is difficult. So we may switch to lower energy dyes to make the dyeing with polyester easier, but they're going to have poorer fastness. Or we use lower dyeing temperatures, in which case the dye doesn't dye the polyester very well, and we get poorer fastness. Meanwhile, if there is any loose dye around, the spandex will absorb it quite readily, and we get poor fastness. So there's three separate reasons here why the fastness properties of a polyester spandex blend may be poor. And that's, again, what the basis for this presentation is. So this is, Addy's not here. Addy Chainer collects problems from all over the place and tries to analyze them and pops down to my lab sometimes, and we argue and chat and do stuff. So we had a whole bunch of these polyester spandex things, and we looked at some problem dyes. We know they're bad. So these are low energy dyes. They were not well reduction cleared. And then we reduction cleared them to see how much we could improve them. We actually rinsed them in solvent to see how much we could improve them. And we stored them for periods of time and then saw what changed. We also beat the bushes and found people who could supply us with things they claimed were good. Reputable people using good dyes, clearing them well. Try this, it should be good. Okay, so let's run some tests on this very poor dye. Here's the deeply colored spandex under the microscope. But the crop test isn't bad. I mean, there's loose dye all over the place here. It's not on the polyester, but if we use the crop test, it's often a quick and easy way to spot something wrong. It really isn't too bad at all. And this is a problem, unless, here's a nice little weird thing that happens sometimes. It depends where the spandex is. A lot of this is in knits, and the spandex might appear on one face of the fabric or the other. So if the loose dye is on the spandex and the spandex is on one surface, you get a different crop test if you turn the fabric over or not, which is interesting. So I've got this excess dye in my spandex. How am I going to spot it? Well, let's do that. The color fastest laundering test everybody does. Even if it's a dry, clean, only garment, this might still be a test worth doing. I'm not going to wash it, but let's find out what happens. And it's pretty bad. So these are, again, these not very good dyes. 1A wash test. Horrible stain on the multiplier. It's a dry clean only garment, so why don't we go straight to the color fastest to dry cleaning test? Well, we've looked at several dry cleaning solvents on these dyings, and if you rinse them in perk, it's clear that the dye just washes right out of the spandex. So dry cleaning solvents, perk at least, will take that dye out. But the dye is so soluble in the perk that if you have a multifiber there, it's not going to dye the multifiber. The multifiber won't dye from a perk solution of dispersed dye. So the multifiber comes out looking pretty clean. So your color fastest to dry cleaning test looks pretty good, even though it's not a very good dye. In real life dry cleaning, there may be a problem, because I think what happens is that the test, the liquor ratio between the amount of volume of perk and the amount of fabric will differ in the test versus in real life dry cleaning. So in real life dry cleaning, they're using a lower liquor ratio. Fabric wet with perk might touch white fabric and mark off in that real life situation. So sometimes the dry cleaning test is not a good one. The color fastest and solvent spotting test is not as well known as it might be. Just drop some solvent onto a piece of fabric on top of blotting paper. I did it here with perk and with acetone on this crappy dye. And you can see that there's lots and lots of colour there to ooze out, to show me that I've got a lot of loose colour. I find that hard to rate. If I'm trying to rate that as a 3 or 4 or 5 or 1 or 2, that uneven distribution to me suggests that it's going to be difficult to do that reliably. So one thing we played with was just taking the fabric and acetone, controlled amounts, shaking it up, and just dropping a spot of that acetone extract onto the blotting paper. And again, you can see that up here we get some nice clean spots that you could get a grayscale rating on quite well. So maybe there's room for a modified test here. Dye transfer and storage is a water-based test using the perspirometer, but these dyes are not water-soluble, so unmodified they're not going to show you much. We postulated that maybe sewing oil might be an accelerant for the movement of dye. We postulated that maybe there's some warmer conditions might make this reveal more. So here's the results down here. Here are little drops of sewing machine oil onto these fabrics, and again that does tend to wash the dye out and let it stain in this test. So that's an interesting possibility of revealing potential for problems. So we found some things that show up as bad dye and some that don't. So let's look at this dyeing and try and reduction clear it. Now the spandex is still not clean, but it's a lot cleaner than the black we had before. One thing to note, looking at some of the work behind this, is that all dyes are not equally reduction clearable. So here's an online reference for a dye that doesn't clear, a dye that clears very well. Again, red, yellow, blue, some dyes clear well, some dyes do not. Here's a paper from Coloration Technology that looks in quite a lot of detail about how easy some dyes are to clear and some dyes are not. The crock fastness wasn't bad, it does get a little better. Wash fastness improved, again, there's still some staining coming off here, so that brown stain on the spandex is still coming out in a 1A wash. I still got loose dye that I can wash out with my solvent. Again, it's gotten a lot better, but it's still present. Here's that dye transfer and storage again. Here's the original dyeing, here's the reduction cleared dyeing. I'm still getting quite a lot of stain on here. Again, my reduction clearing process didn't totally clear out the spandex. It's amazing how much dye was loose on this piece of fabric. So this is a lasagna pan and half a pint of acetone, rinsing this fabric out, and it's just loaded. And here's rinse number 2, and it's still loaded. Eventually, we got the spandex to be pretty clean. So if you really dry clean this fabric, this is what the dry cleaning would do. We would rinse out a whole lot of dye. I don't know what would happen in the rest of the dry cleaning load. I don't want my stuff to be in there with it. Still haven't got perfect crock fastness, especially on this one. But again, it's getting better. Wash fastness, pretty good. My solvent spotting test shows that I've really gotten rid of everything and there's almost nothing left on the fabric. My dye transfer and storage is a lot better. So I've really improved this dyeing quite well. But what would happen if I stored that nice clean dyeing and left it for a while? Does the dye continue to ooze out of the polyester and recontaminate the spandex? So we did this in the accelerated dye transfer and storage conditions in a plastic bag with a beaker of water in the oven at 90 degrees Celsius overnight. And I also included some fabrics that were soaked in some potential dye looseners, if you like. Silicone, polyethylene softener, non-ionic detergent, and a leveling agent. Very low concentrations, 1 gram per liter, but fabrics were wet with those. And this is the white piece of polyester they were sat on as they were in that plastic bag overnight. Again, this is a cleaned up dye. I really cleaned this dye up, but still, those accelerants were letting dye wash out of the polyester or ooze out of the polyester under those conditions. My wash fastness went and got worse again. Here's the cleaned up dyeing. Here's the wash fastness again. My solvent spotting hasn't gotten really bad, but I'm getting a little bit more here than here, and a little bit more here than here. So my problem dyeing is still a problem. Let's look at my two good dyings. I'm coding them A and T. Guess what they mean? You will. Again, these are well-prepared dyings. People who know what they're doing. Crop fastness is good. Wash fastness shows that there's some loose dye on A. T is pretty clean. Here's my solvent spotting test. So I think the A dye, again, it was well cleared, but probably those are dyes that do not respond well to reduction clearing. And there's still a lot of dye left, even after it's been well reduction cleared. This one, nice and clean. Dye transfer and storage test. My spots didn't maintain their place very well, but these dyes do transfer a lot in storage. So, you know, this is a pretty bad stain after this 24-hour, 90 degrees C, high humidity test. Even from the T dye, which had that very clean spandex, no acetone stain, still has dye transferring out of the polyester. So I'll take those good dyings and store them, re-accelerate the loss of dye. Again, my crop's not revealing much. Maybe hard to see, but this is back getting a little bit worse on the wash fastness. So the accelerants are letting the dye ooze out. My acetone spot here, this is the original dyeing. My storage conditions show that I'm starting to ooze dye out of the polyester. Again, this is a little worse than this. So again, over storage, polyester is losing dye. What about that dry heat sublimation? This is that original crappy dyeing. Oh, sorry, this is the original crappy dyeing and the cleaned up dyeing. So the original crappy dyeing, again, the dye just flies off. 200 Celsius for 30 seconds in a scorch test. The dye just flies off this and stains the multi-fiber. Here's my acetone stain again. If I do that on the cleaned up dye, this dye that's flying all over the place is not jumping onto the spandex. So the spandex is now clean, even though I've sublimed a lot of dye away from the polyester. Use the two good dyings. This is the A, which is the one that had loose dye that didn't reduction clear, but they're using very high energy dyes that don't sublime in this scorch test. The less good one that had the acetone, that had the poor acetone stain, medium energy dyes, so I'm getting some stain in my scorch test, and this time the dyes are low enough energy that they will stain the polyester as they sublime. So sublimation may end up making dye on the polyester, sorry, on the spandex, or not. It's not predictable that the dye will end up there. So what, I hear you ask. And I apologize, I've got no clear conclusions for you.
Tell us the answer.
Did you get a paper out of it?
Not yet. I'm refining it as we speak.
Oh, no.
So, number one, the tests we use often as simple spot a problem kinds of tests. The dry cleaning test, the crocking test, may not tell you something as far as these blends are concerned. Tests that are less relevant, like the 1A wash, even if it's dry cleaning only, an accelerated dye transfer and storage test, or a solvent spotting test, may be more useful to tell you that there's loose dye around. Dyes vary their ability to be reduction cleared, so even if you say, honest, I reduction cleared it, you know, that may not solve the problem. And that ability of dye to move way downstream from when it was dyed means that the dyeing you test may be very different from the dyeing that left the dye bath. And it may be very difficult to spot where the problem came about. Is it a reduction clearing problem? Is it a finishing problem? Is it a heat setting problem? Is it a storage problem? Is it a sewing problem after which there's storage? Or some combination of all of these. There's so many things that happen between the dye bath and the shelf, and you really cannot be sure where the problems arise. But those problems we have on this blend may be a lot worse by stuff that started out in the dyeing finishing process, or somewhere else like the sewing one. And here's the real nasty thing. You can have a really good dyeing that somehow might hit circumstances on its way down the supply chain that leave it with a problem or cause a problem. And meanwhile, a not very good dyeing might avoid all those situations and be okay. That's not fair. So, since we have no idea what the conditions will be exposed to, even if we have a great test, even if we have the great test to show there's loose dye on the spandex, or to show that that dye can be transferred, it will be very difficult to determine what level of fastness on that test is going to match the conditions that your fabric goes through, because you don't know what those conditions are. And so we have this dichotomy, this dilemma of saying, well, I'm going to impose really strict fastness standards, and I may be throwing away stuff or rejecting goods that might perform really well, or I loosen my standards and I risk customer complaints. And the only bottom line I can offer you is this: as long as you know, and knowledge is power. So find a good test and test often.